In a quiet courtroom filled with tension, a young black teen sat alone at the defendant's table, her hands trembling as she clutched the arms of her chair. She had never imagined she would be here, accused of a crime she didn't commit, facing a judge who seemed determined to make an example out of her. The air was heavy with whispers, the murmurs of people who had already made up their minds about her. The evidence didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. It was clear from the moment she walked in that the odds were stacked against her. The judge, an older man with cold, calculating eyes, leaned forward, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You can drop the act," he sneered. "We all know what kind of person you are." His words stung like a slap, and the smirk on his face sent chills down her spine. The prosecutor nodded along, barely trying to hide his satisfaction. It was almost as if they had already decided her fate before the trial even began. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to prove her innocence. But how? No one was listening. No one cared. Every argument her lawyer made was brushed aside. Every piece of evidence that could have cleared her name was dismissed as irrelevant. It was like she was trapped in a nightmare, one she couldn't wake up from. Then as the judge lifted his gavel, preparing to announce her fate, she did the only thing she could think of. She reached for her phone. Her fingers fumbled as she dialed the number she knew by heart. It rang once, twice, and then he answered. "Dad," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Please, help me." Silence. Then a shift in the air, as if the entire world had just paused for a moment. The judge's smirk faltered. The prosecutor's confidence wavered. And the bailiff, who had been standing stiffly at attention, suddenly seemed nervous. Because what they didn't know, what they never even considered, was who she really was. She wasn't just another scared teenager caught in the system. She wasn't just another statistic. She was the daughter of the most powerful lawyer in the country, the U.S. Attorney General. And now he was on the other end of the line. The judge's face went pale as the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. But it was too late. The game they had been playing, the corruption they had gotten away with for so long, it was all about to come crashing down. Because justice was coming, and it was coming fast. The judge's hand froze midair, the gavel inches from slamming down. His smug expression twisted into something else, uncertainty, maybe even fear. The courtroom, which had been filled with murmurs moments ago, fell into an eerie silence. Every eye turned toward the girl as she clutched the phone, her knuckles white. On the other end of the call, her father's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath it. "Where are you?" he asked, his words measured, controlled. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "I'm in court. They're trying to convict me for something I didn't do," she managed to say. She could hear the slight shift in his tone, the way his silence carried weight. He didn't need to raise his voice to be intimidating. The judge cleared his throat, regaining some of his composure. "You need to hang up that phone." "Now," he said, his voice lower, more serious. She ignored him. "Dad, they're not listening to me," she continued. "They won't even look at the evidence." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a quick glance with the judge. The confidence they had minutes ago had vanished. The judge sat back, gripping the edge of his desk, as if he needed something to hold on to. Then her father spoke again, his voice carrying a finality that made the room feel even smaller. "Put me on speaker." Her heart pounded as she did what he asked, pressing the button and placing the phone on the table. The courtroom was so silent that even the faint sound of breathing could be heard. "This is U.S. Attorney General Michael Carter," he announced. The weight of his name settled over the room like a thundercloud. "I want to know why my daughter is standing trial for a crime she didn't commit." The judge's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to snatch the phone away. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, forcing a smile. This is all just a misunderstanding. Michael cut him off. I'm looking at the case file right now, he said. And what I see is a mass of fabricated charges, missing evidence, and witness statements that don't match. Care to explain that? The judge's face darkened. This is highly inappropriate, he snapped. Your daughter is a defendant in my courtroom, not a special case. Michael's voice didn't waver. Then treat her fairly. Because from what I can see, you haven't been doing that. The tension in the room thickened. The bailiff shifted his stance, glancing toward the judge as if waiting for direction. The spectators, once ready to dismiss the girl as guilty, now sat on the edge of their seats. She had never seen the judge rattled before. He had built his reputation on control, on always being the one with the final word. But now, under the weight of her father's voice, he looked different. Not powerful, not in charge, just exposed. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Mr. Carter. It's Attorney General Carter, Michael corrected, his patience thinning. And I want to know why my daughter wasn't given proper legal representation, why key evidence was ignored, and why this case moved to trial so quickly despite having no substantial proof. No one had an answer. The girl felt her heart pounding in her chest. She had never doubted her father's strength, but now she was seeing it firsthand. He wasn't just angry, he was methodical, calculating, and most of all, he wasn't going to let this slide. The judge let out a slow breath. This case was handled according to procedure, he said, his voice quieter now. Michael didn't even hesitate. Then you won't mind if I have federal investigators review it, he said smoothly. And if I find any sign of corruption, any sign at all, that this trial was manipulated, I will make sure that every person responsible is held accountable. The color drained from the prosecutor's face. The judge shifted in his seat, looking at the papers in front of him as if they might somehow save him. The girl exhaled slowly, her grip on the phone loosening just a little. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something close to hope. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Because the judge wasn't just going to back down. He had been in power too long, gotten away with too much. And she could see it in his eyes. He was already thinking of a way out. And whatever he was planning next, she had a feeling it was going to be even worse. The judge inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around his gavel. His whole career had been built on authority, his courtroom, his rules. But now for the first time in years, that authority was slipping through his fingers. His reputation, his control, everything he had carefully maintained, was now hanging by a thread. And the worst part, that thread was being pulled by a teenage girl and her father on the other end of the phone. The prosecutor, still seated beside him, was equally shaken. He had seen questionable cases before, had even pushed a few through when it benefited him, but nothing like this. He had assumed this trial would be an easy win, a quick conviction, no resistance. Just another kid with no resources, no power. But now they weren't just up against a scared teenager. They were up against the U.S. Attorney General. The girl could see the flicker of panic in their eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. And yet, she knew better than to relax. Men like this didn't just surrender. They fought back, and they fought dirty. The judge straightened in his seat, clearing his throat. "This is still my courtroom," he announced, regaining some of his composure. "And I will not tolerate outside interference." Michael's voice remained steady. "This isn't interference. This is accountability." The judge's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, the doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly creaked open. A tall man in a dark suit walked in, his presence shifting the energy of the room instantly. His polished shoes echoed against the floor as he moved with deliberate confidence toward the girl's table. She didn't recognize him, but the way the prosecutor tensed told her everything she needed to know. This was someone powerful, someone connected. And judging by the way he glanced at the judge before turning to her, he wasn't on her side. The man gave her a polite but empty smile. "Apologies for the interruption," he said smoothly, looking down at her with practiced indifference. "I'm here as a legal representative for the court. I'd like to have a word with you in private." She glanced at the judge, then at the prosecutor. Neither met her eyes. Something wasn't right. Michael must have sensed it, too, because his voice came through the speaker, sharp and unwavering. "No, whatever you have to say to my daughter, you can say in front of everyone." The man barely reacted, just tilted his head slightly. "I think it's in her best interest to speak privately." Michael let out a dry laugh. "You think I don't know what's happening here? You're trying to intimidate her into silence. That won't work." The man exhaled through his nose, clearly unfazed. He turned his attention back to the girl, lowering his voice just enough that it felt like a warning. "Miss Carter, this can go one of two ways. Either you cooperate or you make things much more difficult for yourself." Her stomach twisted, but she lifted her chin. "I didn't do anything wrong." The man smiled again, but this time there was something colder behind it. "That's not what the evidence says." Her fingers curled into fists. That evidence was planted. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, regaining control of the room. "Enough of this," he snapped. "The court will proceed as scheduled." But Michael wasn't done. "That's where you're wrong, Your Honor," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Because as of right now, I have a team reviewing this case. And if I find anything illegal, any misconduct at all, you will be facing more than just a courtroom full of spectators. You'll be facing a federal investigation." The judge's nostrils flared, but before he could respond, the prosecutor quickly leaned in, whispering something to him. The judge's fingers twitched around his gavel, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, no one spoke. The air in the room felt thick with unspoken threats. The girl could feel the weight of every stare, the careful calculation happening behind every expression. Then, without warning, the judge let out a tight, forced chuckle. "Very well," he said, leaning back in his chair. "If you want to waste time reviewing the case, be my guest. But until then, this trial will proceed." The girl's heart pounded. He wasn't backing down. And worse, he was stalling. She could see it now. The way the prosecutor suddenly looked less panicked. The way the man in the suit had taken a step back, hands in his pockets, as if waiting for something. Something was coming. Something she couldn't see yet. And whatever it was, she had a feeling it was going to turn this entire case into something even more dangerous. The girl's pulse pounded in her ears as she glanced around the courtroom. Something was shifting, something she couldn't quite put into words, but she could feel it pressing down on her like a weight. The judge had relaxed just slightly, but that was what made it terrifying. He wasn't worried anymore. That meant he had a plan. Her father was still on the line, his voice steady but laced with something new. Urgency. "Sweetheart, listen to me carefully," he said, his tone quieter now. "Do not agree to anything. Do not answer any questions without legal counsel present." She gripped the edge of the table, nodding even though he couldn't see her. "Okay." The judge leaned forward, folding his hands as if he was suddenly the picture of reason. "Since there seems to be some concern over fairness," he said, his voice dripping with forced patience, "I am willing to allow a brief recess." That should give the prosecution time to clear up any misunderstandings. The prosecutor shot him a confused glance, but the judge barely acknowledged it. The girl knew what was happening. He was buying time. But for what? The man in the suit didn't leave. He remained by the prosecutor's table, his presence unsettling. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was something more. And he wasn't here for justice. Her father must have been thinking the same thing. Who just entered the courtroom? He asked, his voice low and cautious. She hesitated. Some lawyer. I think, but he's different. Michael didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was clipped. Describe him. She did, keeping her voice low, not wanting to draw attention. As soon as she finished, there was a long pause. Then finally, her father spoke. That's not a lawyer, he said. That's Raymond Locke. He works with powerful defense teams, but not the kind that fight for justice. The kind that clean up political messes. Her stomach dropped. So, why is he here? Michael exhaled sharply. Because someone very high up doesn't want this case getting any further. Her hands felt clammy. She knew this trial was unfair, but now she realized it was bigger than that. Bigger than just her. They weren't just trying to convict her. They were trying to silence her. Locke finally spoke, stepping forward. Your Honor, he said smoothly, given the new concerns raised by the defense, I believe it would be appropriate to reconsider bail. The judge barely hesitated. Denied. The girl's breath caught. They weren't even trying to make it look fair anymore. Locke didn't seem surprised. He turned to her, his gaze unreadable. Then I request that she be placed in protective custody for the duration of the trial. Her heart stopped. No, Michael's voice snapped through the phone before she could even process what had just been said. That's not happening. Locke didn't even flinch. Your Honor, given the attention this case is receiving, I believe it's in the best interest of everyone involved that she be placed in a secure location. Secure. The word sent a chill through her. He wasn't talking about protection. He was talking about getting her somewhere they could control her, away from her father, away from anyone who could help. The judge gave a slow nod. I agree. The girl's throat went dry. Wait. I object, Michael said sharply. You have no legal grounds. She is a flight risk, Locke cut in smoothly. And given the nature of the charges, the court has every right to ensure she remains available for trial. The judge nodded. Agreed. Panic surged in her chest. She looked around the room, her breath coming quicker. You can't do this, she said, her voice trembling. I haven't done anything. The judge didn't even look at her. Bailiff, remove her from the courtroom. Her chair scraped against the floor as she pushed back, her pulse hammering in her ears. No, you can't. The bailiff grabbed her arm. Don't you touch her, Michael's voice roared through the phone. But there was nothing he could do. He wasn't here. The girl struggled, but the bailiff's grip tightened. The courtroom blurred around her. She could hear voices, movement, but none of it made sense. All she knew was that they were taking her. And if they took her, she might never come back. The girl's breath came in quick, shallow bursts as the bailiff tightened his grip on her arm, dragging her toward the exit. The room around her seemed a blur, voices mixing into a chaotic hum. Somewhere behind her, the judge's gavel slammed down, but the sound barely registered. Her father's voice crackled through the phone, sharp and urgent. I need you to stay calm, he said, though there was an edge to his tone that told her even he was struggling to keep his composure. I'm making calls. Do not let them intimidate you. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he could stop this, but she could feel the cold finality of it in the way the bailiff moved. Quick, firm, unquestioning. These people weren't just bending the rules. They weren't worried about what was right or legal. They were moving with confidence because they believed no one could stop them. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, and she was pulled into the dimly lit hallway. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made her skin crawl. Locke followed closely behind, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor trailed after him, but his face was pale now, his earlier arrogance replaced with something else, uncertainty, maybe even fear. The girl turned her head, desperate for any sign of help. But the hallway was empty. No reporters, no spectators, no one to witness what was happening. She felt the panic clawing at her chest, but she forced herself to swallow it down. They rounded a corner, heading toward a door marked ***, authorized personnel, only ***. That's when the first real wave of terror hit her. This wasn't a holding cell. This wasn't where they took people waiting for trial. This was something else. She dug her heels into the floor, twisting her body against the bailiff's grip. "Where are you taking me?" Locke answered without breaking stride. "Somewhere safe." The way he said it sent a shiver through her. It was the same careful, detached tone people used when they wanted to make something terrible sound reasonable. Her father's voice crackled back to life through the phone still clutched in her hand. "I know what they're doing," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "They're trying to make you disappear from public records before I can intervene. They're setting up an entirely different case, off the books." The words made her blood turn to ice. "What? How?" "Doesn't matter," Michael snapped. "Listen to me. Do ***, not ***, let them take you through that door." She barely had time to process his words before they reached it. The bailiff let go just long enough to swipe his keycard, and in that split second, she reacted. She twisted, yanking her arm free, and sprinted. She didn't think, she just ran. Her sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as she bolted down the hall, her heart hammering in her chest. A sharp voice behind her, Lux, called out, "Stop her." Footsteps thundered after her. Her lungs burned, but she pushed forward, scanning frantically for an exit. There, a side door, propped slightly open. She lunged for it, shoving through the gap just as hands swiped at her jacket. Cold air hit her skin as she stumbled outside, blinking against the sudden brightness. The loading dock. Her mind raced. No obvious exits, just a long stretch of pavement leading toward a gated back entrance. A black SUV sat idling near the fence. The driver looked up, startled, but she didn't have time to figure out who he was. She ran. The door behind her burst open, and the bailiff's voice rang out. "Get back here." Her legs burned, but she didn't stop. She reached the SUV just as the driver scrambled out. His eyes widened in shock. And then he said something that sent another jolt of fear through her. "You're not supposed to be here yet." Yet. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't random. They had a plan. They had a timeline. And somehow, she had thrown it off. Before she could react, a set of powerful hands clamped around her arms from behind, yanking her backward. She screamed, kicking wildly, but Luck's voice was in her ear now, calm and chilling. "You just made this much harder for yourself." Panic surged in her chest. She struggled, but they were stronger. The last thing she saw before they dragged her away was the driver frantically reaching for his phone, muttering something under his breath. And then everything went dark. The girl's breath came in quick, shallow bursts as the bailiff tightened his grip on her arm, dragging her toward the exit. The room around her seemed a blur, voices mixing into a chaotic hum. Somewhere behind her, the judge's gavel slammed down, but the sound barely registered. Her father's voice crackled through the phone, sharp and urgent. "I need you to stay calm," he said, though there was an edge to his tone that told her even he was struggling to keep his composure. "I'm making calls. Do not let them intimidate you." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he could stop this, but she could feel the cold finality of it in the way the bailiff moved. Quick, firm, unquestioning. These people weren't just bending the rules. They weren't worried about what was right or legal. They were moving with confidence because they believed no one could stop them. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, and she was pulled into the dimly lit hallway. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made her skin crawl. Luck followed closely behind, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor trailed after him, but his face was pale now, his earlier arrogance replaced with something else, uncertainty, maybe even fear. The girl turned her head, desperate for any sign of help. But the hallway was empty. No reporters, no spectators, no one to witness what was happening. She felt the panic clawing at her chest, but she forced herself to swallow it down. They rounded a corner, heading toward a door marked *** authorized personnel. On the ***, that's when the first real wave of terror hit her. This wasn't a holding cell. This wasn't where they took people waiting for trial. This was something else. She dug her heels into the floor, twisting her body against the bailiff's grip. "Where are you taking me?" Locke answered without breaking stride. "Somewhere safe." The way he said it sent a shiver through her. It was the same careful, detached tone people used when they wanted to make something terrible sound reasonable. Her father's voice crackled back to life through the phone still clutched in her hand. "I know what they're doing," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "They're trying to make you disappear from public records before I can intervene. They're setting up an entirely different case, off the books." The words made her blood turn to ice. "What? How?" "Doesn't matter," Michael snapped. "Listen to me. Do ***, not ***, let them take you through that door." She barely had time to process his words before they reached it. The bailiff let go just long enough to swipe his keycard, and in that split second she reacted. She twisted, yanking her arm free, and sprinted. She didn't think, she just ran. Her sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as she bolted down the hall, her heart hammering in her chest. A sharp voice behind her, Lux, called out, "Stop her." Footsteps thundered after her. Her lungs burned, but she pushed forward, scanning frantically for an exit. There, a side door, propped slightly open. She lunged for it, shoving through the gap just as hands swiped at her jacket. Cold air hit her skin as she stumbled outside, blinking against the sudden brightness. The loading dock. Her mind raced. No obvious exits, just a long stretch of pavement leading toward a gated back entrance. A black SUV sat idling near the fence. The driver looked up, startled, but she didn't have time to figure out who he was. She ran. The door behind her burst open, and the bailiff's voice rang out. "Get back here." Her legs burned, but she didn't stop. She reached the SUV just as the driver scrambled out. His eyes widened in shock. And then he said something that sent another jolt of fear through her. "You're not supposed to be here yet." Yet. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't random. They had a plan. They had a timeline. And somehow she had thrown it off. Before she could react, a set of powerful hands clamped around her arms from behind, yanking her backward. She screamed, kicking wildly, but Luck's voice was in her ear now, calm and chilling. "You've just made this much harder for yourself." Panic surged in her chest. She struggled, but they were stronger. The last thing she saw before they dragged her away was the driver frantically reaching for his phone, muttering something under his breath. And then everything went dark. The girl's body tensed as the world around her spun into chaos. She was being dragged backward, her feet barely scraping against the pavement as the men tightened their grip. Her breath came in short gasps, her pulse hammering so hard she thought her ribs might crack under the pressure. Then suddenly, sirens. Not just one, several. The men faltered, their grip loosening for just a split second. But that was all she needed. She twisted violently, yanking herself free, and stumbled forward. The black SUV screeched into the lot, surrounding them. Doors flew open, and agents poured out, weapons drawn. Hands in the air. Now. The men holding her hesitated for half a second too long. The next thing she knew, someone tackled her out of the way. She hit the pavement hard, but the strong hands weren't rough. They were protective. A voice she knew all too well cut through the noise. "Get away from my daughter." Michael. Her chest clenched as she turned her head, watching as her father stepped out of a sleek black vehicle, his expression colder than she had ever seen. His suit was slightly wrinkled, like he'd been moving too fast to care. His phone was still in his hand, knuckles white from gripping it. He had been on calls, pulling every string, making sure she was found before it was too late. The men who had grabbed her hesitated, clearly calculating their next move. But they had no moves left. The agents were on them in seconds, pinning them down, disarming them. The driver of the SUV, the one who had whispered that chilling word asterisk asterisk yet asterisk asterisk, tried to slip away in the chaos. But two agents caught him before he could take a step. Michael didn't look at them. He only looked at her. His expression softened, just slightly, as he crouched next to her. "Are you hurt?" She swallowed the lump in her throat and shook her head. No, just, her voice broke. "I thought they were going to." "I know." His jaw tightened. "I know." The next few minutes were a blur. Agents secured the area, more vehicles pulled in, and the judge, asterisk asterisk, the judge asterisk asterisk, was escorted out of the courthouse in cuffs, his furious protests drowned out by the sound of flashing cameras and shouted questions from reporters who had finally caught on to the unfolding scandal. It was over. Or so she thought. Michael helped her to her feet, his arm around her shoulder as he guided her toward the car. She should have felt relief, but something wasn't sitting right. Something about the way this had all played out. She glanced at Locke, now handcuffed, sitting on the pavement with a smirk that shouldn't have been there. "Why do you look so calm?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. Locke tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Because," he said, "you think this is the end." A chill ran down her spine. Michael stiffened beside her. "Get her in the car," he told the nearest agent, his tone leaving no room for argument. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Because Locke wasn't done. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough so that only she could hear. "You weren't supposed to make it out of that building," he murmured. "You weren't supposed to be here at all." Her stomach twisted. "You think this was about you?" He continued, his tone eerily calm. "This was never about you." His eyes flicked up to Michael. "It was about asterisk asterisk, him asterisk asterisk." Her father tensed beside her, but he didn't react. He just placed a firm hand on her shoulder and guided her toward the car. "Don't listen to him," Michael said quietly. But as she climbed inside, Locke's words echoed in her head. This wasn't about her. Then what was it about? And worse, what was coming next? As the car doors shut, muffling the chaos outside, the girl let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The weight of everything pressed down on her at once. The fear, the confusion, the unanswered questions. Her father sat beside her, his jaw clenched, his eyes staring straight ahead. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The car started moving, pulling away from the courthouse, from the flashing lights. from the men who had nearly made her disappear. But she knew they weren't really leaving it behind. Not yet. She turned to Michael, searching his face for answers. "What did Locke mean?" she asked quietly. "Why did he say this was about you?" Michael exhaled through his nose, his fingers tapping against his knee. "Locke is a desperate man," he said finally. "He wants to plant doubt, make us second-guess what we already know. But do we know everything?" She pressed, "Because it doesn't feel like it." Michael didn't answer right away. His silence was enough to confirm her suspicions. There was more to this than what had just played out.